Close your eyes for a moment. Think about a grey Tuesday morning somewhere in England. The radio is playing something by Duran Duran or maybe Madness. There's condensation on the windows, a thermos of tea sitting on the dashboard, and the smell of petrol mixing with damp wool coats. Outside, the high street is just waking up, corner shops pulling back their shutters, kids in uniform kicking puddles on their way to school. The roads are full of colour, boxy little hatchbacks, saloons with rust along the wheel arches, estate cars packed to the roof with everything a family could need. Back then, cars weren't just transport. They were your identity, your freedom, your routine. They were where arguments happened, where songs were sung too loudly, where life played out mile after mile. Today on Britain Rewind, we're counting down 10 of the most iconic cars from 1980s Britain, the machines that didn't just fill the roads, they filled our lives. And the car at number 1 didn't just dominate the roads, it defined an entire generation. Number 10, Vauxhall Cavalier. The Vauxhall Cavalier was the car of the man in the middle. Not poor, not wealthy, just quietly getting on with it. When the Cavalier was refreshed for the 1980s, Britain was a country of salesmen, middle managers, and ambitious young professionals trying to climb whatever ladder they could find. This was their car. You'd see it parked outside semi-detached houses in Coventry, Nottingham, and Leeds, grey or beige or brown, reliable as the 9-to-5 it was built for. Inside, the seats were firm, the dashboard functional, and the radio was usually tuned to Radio 2. Dad drove it to work. Mum used it for the weekly shop at Sainsbury's. On Sundays, the whole family piled in for a drive to a garden centre that no one particularly wanted to visit. The Cavalier wasn't glamorous, but that was never the point. It represented a kind of steady, working dignity, a car that said, "I'm doing all right." When it eventually faded from the roads, it took a very particular kind of British normalcy with it. But coming in at number 9, things start getting a little more personal. Number 9, Ford Escort. If Britain had a national car in the 1980s, the Ford Escort would have a strong case for the title. It was absolutely everywhere. On every estate, outside every terraced house, in every factory car park from Birmingham to Bradford. The Escort had been around since the late 1960s, but by the early 1980s it had become something deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Young lads saved up for months to buy a second-hand one, then spent weekends under the bonnet with their mates, tinkering, souping it up, making it theirs. For young women heading off to their first jobs, it was independence on 4 wheels. For families, it was the school run, the holiday run, the everything run. The seats would wear thin, the doors might creak, and the heating was never quite reliable, but it worked. It always worked. The Escort connected to something real in British culture, a no-nonsense, get-it-done attitude that asked for nothing fancy and delivered everything you needed. It wasn't a dream. It was better than that. It was real life. But at number 8, we meet a car that dared to be something a little more exciting. Number 8, Austin Metro. When the Austin Metro arrived in 1980, it came with the weight of a nation on its small shoulders. British Leyland, the struggling, strike-hit manufacturer behind it, needed a hit, and the government needed proof that British industry still had something to offer. Margaret Thatcher herself posed with the Metro for photographs. It was that kind of moment. And for a while, it genuinely worked. The Metro became a fixture on British streets almost overnight, particularly in towns and cities where parking was tight and money was tighter. Young women loved it. First-time buyers loved it. It was small, it was affordable, and it was proudly, defiantly British. You'd see them in shopping centre car parks, neatly tucked between bigger cars, a cassette sticking out of the player, a furry dashboard mascot on the parcel shelf. The Metro was never perfect, reliability was a genuine concern, but it carried something emotional with it, the stubborn hope of a country trying to rebuild its confidence. When it was eventually replaced, it felt like the end of a particular chapter. At number 7, though, we meet a car that needed no such confidence boost. Number 7, Volkswagen Golf GTI. Not everyone in 1980s Britain drove something sensible. Some people had ambition, or at least, they wanted to look like they did. The Volkswagen Golf GTI arrived in Britain wearing its red stripe badge like a quiet declaration of intent. It was the car of the young professional, the ad agency worker, the estate agent who'd just landed his first commission. Park one of these outside your flat in 1983 and your neighbors would notice. It was sleek, it was fast for its time, and it said something about who you were, or who you wanted to become. On Friday evenings, they'd be parked outside wine bars, their drivers in suits with loosened ties, talking about things they'd heard on the radio. The GTI was the car that made the 1980s feel modern. It connected to the decade's obsession with aspiration, style, and the idea that you could make something of yourself if you wanted it badly enough. It was a symbol of ambition wrapped in German engineering. But at number 6, we leave the wine bars behind and head somewhere altogether more familiar. Number 6, Ford Fiesta. While the GTI was turning heads, the Ford Fiesta was simply getting on with the job. Few cars in Britain's history have felt as universally owned as the Fiesta. It didn't belong to any one class, any one type of person, or any one part of the country. It belonged to everyone. Retired couples used it for gentle trips to the coast. Teenage boys bought battered early models and drove them too fast on country lanes. Nurses drove them to night shifts. Young mums drove them to playgroups. The Fiesta was compact, economical, and easy to park, virtues that mattered enormously in 1980s Britain, when petrol prices were a genuine worry and high street parking spaces hadn't grown any wider. Inside, it was basic but honest: vinyl seats, a simple dash, windows that fogged up the moment you breathed. But it was dependable, and in the 1980s, dependability was a virtue. The Fiesta didn't try to be anything it wasn't. It just showed up, every single day, and did what was needed. That's a kind of beauty in itself. At number 5, we meet a car that tried to offer something a little more comfortable. Number 5, Rover SD1. The Rover SD1 was an ambitious car, perhaps too ambitious for the company that built it. Designed with an almost Italian elegance, it looked like something from a more confident era. In the early 1980s, you'd find it in the driveways of doctors, solicitors, and senior managers, men who wanted a certain kind of quiet distinction without going all the way to a Jaguar. It appeared in the background of British life in a very particular way, outside golf clubs, parked at motorway service stations, sitting in the car parks of county council offices. Inside, the cabin had a warmth to it: wood trim, soft seats, the faint smell of leather and carpet that felt reassuringly grown up. But the SD1 was plagued by reliability issues that its elegant looks couldn't disguise, and slowly the professional classes drifted toward German alternatives. It remains a poignant reminder of what British manufacturing could achieve when it dared to dream, and what it lost when the dream outpaced the execution. At number 4, we step into something altogether more raw and youthful. Number 4, Ford XR3i. If you were young, male, and living in Britain in the mid-1980s, the Ford XR3i was the goal. It wasn't the most powerful car on the road, but it felt electric in a way that mattered to a generation still figuring out who they were. Hot hatchbacks were a cultural moment, and the XR3i was right at the center of it. Saturday nights meant cruising town centers, windows down, music pumping, whatever was on the charts, whatever sounded best with the bass turned up. The XR3i connected to a very specific male working-class experience: the desire to feel fast, to feel free, to have something to show for a week of factory shifts or warehouse work. It was the car outside the chip shop, the car parked across 2 spaces outside the pub, the car that got you somewhere worth going on a Friday night. It was often criticized, frequently stereotyped, but it captured something genuine about youth, energy, and the hunger to feel alive. At number 3, the mood shifts completely. Number 3, Volvo Estate. Every family has a car that defines their childhood, and for a significant portion of 1980s Britain, that car was the Volvo Estate. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't meant to be. It was enormous, practical, and built like a block of flats, and parents absolutely loved it. The Volvo Estate meant summer holidays, the boot packed so tightly with suitcases and cool boxes and buckets and spades that the rear suspension visibly sagged. It meant long drives down motorways to see grandparents, kids fighting in the back seat while dad navigated with a road atlas and mum managed the snacks. It was safe, reassuringly, boringly, wonderfully safe, and in an era when child safety in cars was becoming a real concern that mattered deeply. The Volvo Estate didn't have personality in the conventional sense, but it had character, the character of responsibility, of putting the family first, of Sunday afternoons and National Trust car parks and sandwiches eaten in lay-bys. It was the backbone of middle-class family life. But at number 2, something altogether more surprising. Number 2, Mini. The Mini had been around since 1959, but in the 1980s it became something new all over again. It became countercultural. While bigger, flashier cars dominated the aspirational imagination, the Mini attracted a different crowd: art students, musicians, market traders, people who found identity in not following the crowd. A tatty old Mini in 1985 was a statement that you didn't care about keeping up, that you valued personality over prestige. They were everywhere and yet somehow always distinctive, painted in unusual colors, filled with cassette cases and scarves and the general clutter of a creative life. On narrow city streets and tight country lanes, the Mini felt perfectly in its element, nipping through gaps that larger cars couldn't dream of. It connected generations. Parents who'd owned one in the 1960s found their adult children adopting them all over again. The Mini was never just a car. It was a mood, a philosophy, a tiny rolling piece of British spirit. And yet, as iconic as it was, the Mini wasn't number 1. Because number 1 wasn't just a car. It was Britain itself. Number 1, Ford Sierra. When the Ford Sierra arrived in 1982, it caused a genuine stir. Its smooth, aerodynamic shape was unlike anything Britain had seen before. No sharp angles, no boxy formality, just a sweeping, almost futuristic silhouette that the tabloids immediately nicknamed the Jelly Mold. People laughed, then they bought one, and another, and another. By the mid-1980s, the Sierra was everywhere, absolutely, inescapably, beautifully everywhere. It was in the driveways of new-build houses on the edge of every town in England. It was on the A roads at 7 in the morning, headlights cutting through autumn fog. It was the car that drove the kids to school, carried the weekly shop, survived the bank holiday traffic jam on the M6. The Sierra belonged to no single class, no single type. It was driven by factory managers and office workers, by traveling salesmen and young couples buying their first family car. Inside, it felt genuinely modern for the time, a dashboard that looked like progress, seats that offered real comfort, a heater that actually worked. On long drives, with the radio on and the rain beginning to fall, the Sierra felt like a cocoon from everything outside. It became the backdrop to real life, arguments and laughter, sing-alongs and silences, the private world that exists only inside a moving car. The Sierra wasn't glamorous. It wasn't rebellious or countercultural or exclusive. It was something harder to achieve and more valuable. It was universal. It was Britain in motion, a nation of ordinary people living ordinary lives with quiet determination. When it was eventually discontinued, something unmistakable disappeared from British roads, a particular shape against the skyline that meant, simply, home. The 1980s were complicated, contradictory, and sometimes difficult, but these cars carried Britain through all of it. They were on the school run and the factory run, at the seaside and in the supermarket car park. They were rusting quietly on terrace streets and gleaming outside new builds. They weren't just machines. They were witnesses to marriages and divorces, first jobs and redundancies, children growing up and parents growing old. Each one of these cars holds a memory for someone watching this right now. So tell us in the comments, which car do you remember most? Which one was parked outside your house? Which one takes you straight back to the 1980s the moment you see it? Until next time.